The sound of a woman's voice drifting through the open window of the Miller homestead stopped Jake Thornton dead in his tracks, his hand frozen on the gate latch as the sweetest melody he had ever heard wrapped around him like warm honey on a cold morning. He had ridden into the small town of Redemption Springs, Texas, on a Tuesday afternoon in late April of 1882. Dust from the cattle trail still coating his clothes and exhaustion sitting heavy in his bones after 3 months of driving 2,000 head of longhorns north to Kansas. Jake was 26 years old, broad-shouldered and weather-worn, with dark hair that touched his collar and gray eyes that had seen both the best and worst of what the frontier had to offer. He had planned to collect his pay, sleep for a week straight, and then figure out what came next in his life. He had not planned to fall completely and utterly under a spell cast by a voice singing a lullaby. The song was one he remembered from his own childhood, something his mother had sung before fever took her when he was barely 8 years old. The words floated clearly through the spring air, gentle and pure, and Jake found himself walking toward the sound without conscious thought. He moved around the side of the whitewashed house, following the melody until he could see through the side window into what appeared to be a sitting room. A young woman sat in a rocking chair, her back partially to him, with an infant cradled against her chest. Her hair was the color of autumn wheat, pulled back in a simple braid that fell past her shoulders, and even from his limited view, Jake could see the tender way she held the baby, swaying gently as she sang. The child was sleeping peacefully, tiny fist curled against the woman's shoulder, and the scene was so perfectly peaceful that Jake felt like an intruder just witnessing it. He should have walked away. He knew that. But his boots seemed rooted to the Texas soil as the woman finished one lullaby and transitioned seamlessly into another. Her voice never wavered, never faltered, each note carrying a warmth and love that made Jake's chest ache with a longing he had not known he possessed. "That is Miss Caroline Webb, if you are wondering." Jake spun around, his hand instinctively moving toward the revolver at his hip before he recognized Doc Patterson, the town physician who had sewn up a gash in Jake's arm the last time he had passed through Redemption Springs nearly 2 years ago. "Doc," Jake said, relaxing his stance and feeling heat creep up his neck at being caught staring through someone's window like a fool. "I was not. I just heard the singing and—" Doc Patterson smiled, his weathered face crinkling with amusement. "No need to explain, son. Half the town has found themselves drawn to Caroline's singing at one point or another. She has a gift, that girl does." The older man moved to stand beside Jake, both of them now watching through the window as Caroline gently rose from the rocking chair and carried the sleeping infant toward what must be a cradle. "That is the Miller baby she is holding. Sarah Miller had twin girls 3 weeks ago, and Caroline has been helping with them nearly every day since." "She is the nanny?" Jake asked, though something in his gut told him that was not quite right. "Not officially," Doc said, shaking his head. "Caroline just helps. Sarah Miller is her friend, and the twins are a handful, so Caroline comes by to give Sarah a few hours of rest. She does the same for half a dozen families in town. Anytime someone has a new baby, Caroline appears with a basket of food and offers to help however she can. The children love her, and she seems to love them right back." Jake watched as Caroline settled the baby into the cradle, tucking a soft blanket around the tiny form with infinite care. When she straightened and turned toward the window, Jake got his first clear look at her face, and the breath left his lungs in a rush. She was beautiful, but not in the painted, polished way of saloon girls or the prim, proper way of Eastern ladies. Caroline's beauty was natural and unadorned, with a spattering of freckles across her nose, wide blue eyes that reflected genuine kindness, and a soft smile that lingered on her lips even as she gazed down at the sleeping child. She appeared to be in her early 20s, and there was something both strong and gentle in the set of her shoulders, the tilt of her head. "She is not married." The words left Jake's mouth before he could stop them, and he immediately wanted to kick himself for asking. Doc Patterson's expression grew more serious. No, though not for lack of men trying, Caroline has turned down 3 proposals that I know of in the past 2 years. She runs the schoolhouse here in Redemption Springs, teaches all the children from 6 to 16, and she seems perfectly content with her life as it is. He paused, studying Jake with keen eyes. Why do you ask? Jake dragged his gaze away from the window and cleared his throat. Just curious, Doc, that is all. The physician made a noncommittal sound that suggested he did not believe that for a second, but he did not press the issue. Well, if you are staying in town for a spell, you will likely run into Miss Webb soon enough. Redemption Springs is not so big that paths do not cross regularly. He tipped his hat. I have patients to check on. Welcome back, Jake. As Doc Patterson walked away, Jake forced himself to step back from the window and head toward the boarding house where he planned to rent a room. But the sound of Caroline's singing followed him through the dusty streets, echoing in his mind long after the actual music had faded into silence. That night, lying in a narrow bed with clean sheets and a roof over his head for the first time in months, Jake stared at the ceiling and wondered what it said about him that he could not stop thinking about a woman he had never even spoken to. He had known plenty of women in his 26 years, had even fancied himself in love once or twice when he was younger and more foolish. But something about Caroline Webb had reached inside his chest and grabbed hold of something essential, something he had not known was waiting to be claimed. The memory of her cradling that baby, singing with such tender devotion, played over and over in his mind. Jake had never given much thought to having a family of his own. His life had been consumed with survival, with earning enough money to get by, with the endless cycle of cattle drives and drifting from town to town. But watching Caroline, seeing the love in her eyes as she held that child, had awakened something primal and powerful within him. He wanted that. Wanted a home, a family, a woman who would look at their children with that same fierce tenderness Caroline had shown to babies that were not even her own. And more specifically, more impossibly, he wanted it with her. Jake rolled over, punching his pillow into a more comfortable shape, and told himself he was being ridiculous. He was a drifting cowboy with barely $200 to his name and no real prospects beyond the next cattle drive. Caroline Webb was an educated schoolteacher, beloved by her community, with a secure position and a good reputation. She was the kind of woman who deserved a solid, upstanding man with a house and land and a future to offer. But even as he listed all the reasons why pursuing Caroline would be foolish, Jake knew with bone-deep certainty that he was going to do it anyway. He had faced down stampedes, outlaws, and storms that could strip the hide off a man's back. Surely he could find the courage to speak to a woman, even one who made his heart pound harder than a full gallop across open prairie. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of golden hair and lullabies and a pair of blue eyes looking at him with the same tenderness he had seen her show those borrowed babies. Morning arrived with bright sunshine streaming through the boarding house window, and Jake woke with a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. He washed, shaved carefully, and put on his cleanest shirt before heading downstairs to the dining room where breakfast was being served. Mrs. Kowalski, the boarding house owner, was a round Polish woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, but she served generous portions and kept a clean establishment. She looked Jake up and down as he entered the dining room, taking in his freshly shaved face and neatly combed hair with obvious amusement. "You look like a man with plans," she observed, setting a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits in front of him. "Just thought I would explore the town a bit," Jake said, keeping his tone casual. "It has been a while since I was last here. Things change." "Some things," Mrs. Kowalski agreed. "Some things stay the same. The church had a new steeple built last summer. The saloon got a new mirror from San Francisco, and Miss Webb is still breaking hearts left and right without even trying." Jake nearly choked on his coffee. "Excuse me?" Mrs. Kowalski's eyes twinkled. "Do not play innocent with me, young man. Doc Patterson was in here last evening, mentioned he saw you standing outside the Miller place, watching through the window like a love-struck pup. News travels fast in a small town. Heat crept up Jake's neck, but he forced himself to meet Mrs. Kowalski's gaze steadily. I heard singing. It was beautiful, so I stopped to listen. That is all. Hum. Mrs. Kowalski did not look convinced, but she patted his shoulder as she passed. Just so you know, Miss Webb takes her lunch at the schoolhouse around noon most days. The schoolhouse is the red building at the east end of Main Street. Cannot miss it. Jake opened his mouth to say he had not asked, but Mrs. Kowalski had already bustled back into the kitchen, leaving him alone with his breakfast and the warmth spreading through his chest at her unsubtle hint. He spent the morning wandering through Redemption Springs, reacquainting himself with the layout of the town. It was bigger than he remembered, with several new businesses lining Main Street. The general store had expanded. There was a new dress shop that catered to the growing number of families settling in the area, and the bank looked more substantial than the small wooden building he recalled from his last visit. But despite his attempts to focus on the town's growth and changes, Jake's feet kept carrying him toward the east end of Main Street, toward the red schoolhouse that sat on a small rise overlooking the rest of the settlement. He could hear children's voices as he approached, a chorus of young students reciting something in unison. Jake moved closer, staying at a respectful distance from the building until he could make out the words they were saying. Multiplication tables, he realized. The students were practicing their multiplication tables. Then Caroline's voice rose above the chorus, clear and encouraging. Excellent work, everyone. Now let us try the 7 times table. Remember, take your time and think through each problem. The children began reciting again, and Jake found himself mouthing along with numbers he had learned so long ago they were automatic. He remembered his own brief years of schooling, cut short when his mother died and he had to work to help support his younger sister. His sister, Mary, was married now, living in Colorado with her husband and 3 children. Jake had not seen her in over a year, though they exchanged letters when he managed to stay in one place long enough to receive mail. The thought of Mary made him smile. She would have liked Caroline, he thought. Mary had always valued kindness and gentleness, qualities that seemed to radiate from the schoolteacher even in the brief glimpse he had caught of her. A bell rang inside the schoolhouse, and moments later, the door burst open as children of various ages spilled out into the yard, chattering and laughing as they scattered toward their homes or the shade of nearby trees where they had left lunch pails. Jake stepped back, not wanting to seem like he was lurking, but his eyes remained fixed on the schoolhouse door. Caroline appeared a moment later, framed in the doorway, and Jake's heart did that strange, stuttering thing again. She wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, her hair once again in a practical braid, and she held a basket over one arm. As he watched, she settled onto the steps of the schoolhouse, opening the basket to reveal what appeared to be her lunch. This was his chance. Jake knew that if he did not approach her now, he would spend the rest of the day berating himself for cowardice. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and started walking toward the schoolhouse with far more confidence than he actually felt. Caroline looked up as he approached, her expression open and curious but not alarmed. Up close, she was even more lovely than she had appeared through the window, with clear skin, intelligent eyes, and a smattering of freckles that Jake found utterly charming. "Hello," she said, her voice as warm and melodious in conversation as it had been in song. "Are you looking for someone? Most of the children have gone home for lunch." "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you, Miss Webb," Jake said, stopping at a respectful distance and removing his hat. "My name is Jake Thornton. I just got back into town yesterday after a cattle drive." Recognition flickered across her face. "Oh, you are one of the ranch hands who work the drives north. I think I may have seen you around town before, though we have never been formally introduced." She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "It is nice to meet you properly, Mr. Thornton." "Jake, please," he said, And I apologize for interrupting your lunch. I just wanted to introduce myself and maybe, well, I heard you singing yesterday. Something shifted in Caroline's expression, a wariness that had not been there before. You heard me singing? Yes, ma'am. I was passing by the Miller place and your voice it stopped me in my tracks. It was the most beautiful thing I have heard in years. Jake twisted his hat in his hands, feeling awkward and clumsy but determined to push through. I hope you do not think I was spying or anything inappropriate. I just could not help but listen. The wariness faded slightly, replaced by something that might have been pleasure mixed with embarrassment. That is very kind of you to say, though I am just singing lullabies to babies. Nothing special. It sounded special to me, Jake said honestly. Doc Patterson told me you help out with a lot of the families in town looking after their babies when they need an extra hand. Caroline nodded, relaxing a bit more. I love children. Teaching them is wonderful, but there is something magical about babies, the way they trust you completely, the way they find comfort in simple things like a song or a gentle touch. Her eyes softened, and Jake saw that same tender expression from yesterday cross her face. I suppose it is silly, but I cannot seem to help myself. Whenever I hear someone has had a baby, I just want to meet the little one and help however I can. That is not silly at all, Jake said, and he meant it. It is kind and rare. Most people are too wrapped up in their own concerns to go out of their way for others. They looked at each other for a long moment, and Jake felt something pass between them, a connection that was fragile but real. Caroline's cheeks flushed pink and she glanced down at the basket in her lap. Would you like to join me for lunch? She asked, her voice soft. I have more than enough. Mrs. Henley at the boarding house always packs me too much food. Jake's heart soared. I would like that very much, thank you. He settled onto the steps beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance, as Caroline pulled out sandwiches wrapped in cloth, apples, and a small jar of lemonade. She handed him a sandwich and an apple, and they ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the sounds of the town drifting around them. So you work cattle drives, Caroline said after a while. That must be exciting, seeing different places, being out on the open range. Jake considered that. It can be. It is also hard, dirty work with long hours and plenty of danger. But yes, there is something about being out there under the stars, nothing but the herd and the land stretching on forever. It makes you feel small and significant at the same time, if that makes any sense. It does, Caroline said, surprising him. I sometimes feel that way when I look up at the night sky. Like I am just a tiny speck in the grand scheme of things, but also part of something much bigger and more beautiful than I can fully understand. They talked as they ate, the conversation flowing more easily than Jake had dared hope. Caroline told him about teaching, about the challenges and rewards of helping children learn. Jake found himself telling her about the cattle drive, about the landscape they had crossed, and the small towns they had passed through. He carefully edited out the more dangerous or unsavory parts, not wanting to worry her or give her a bad impression. Too soon, the church bell chimed, signaling that the lunch hour was ending. Caroline began packing up the remains of their meal, and Jake helped her, their hands brushing briefly as they both reached for the lemonade jar. The contact sent a jolt through him, and from the quick intake of breath he heard from Caroline, she had felt it too. I should get back to teaching, she said, rising from the steps. The afternoon students will be arriving soon. Jake stood as well, settling his hat back on his head. Thank you for sharing your lunch with me, Miss Webb. I really enjoyed talking with you. Caroline, she corrected gently. If I am to call you Jake, then you should call me Caroline. He smiled, loving the way her name felt on his tongue. Caroline, she returned his smile, and there was something warm and promising in her eyes. Will you be staying in Redemption Springs for a while, Jake? I am planning to, at least for a few weeks, maybe longer depending on how things go. Then perhaps we will see each other again. I would like that, Jake said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. As children began arriving for the afternoon session, Jake reluctantly took his leave, walking back toward the center of town with a lightness in his step that had nothing to do with the good meal and everything to do with the woman he had just shared it with. Over the next 2 weeks, Jake found reasons to be near the schoolhouse nearly every day. He helped repair a loose board on the front steps, offered to carry water from the well when he saw Caroline struggling with a heavy bucket, and made a point of being available whenever she might need assistance with anything. If the other townspeople noticed his sudden devotion to being helpful around the school, they were kind enough not to comment, at least not to his face. Caroline seemed to welcome his presence, greeting him with genuine warmth each time they encountered each other. They fell into an easy pattern of sharing lunch together several times a week, their conversations ranging from serious topics like the growth of the town and the challenges facing settlers, to lighter subjects like favorite books and childhood memories. Jake learned that Caroline had come to Redemption Springs 3 years ago from Mississippi, leaving behind a family that had lost everything in the war and its aftermath. She had trained as a teacher with the help of a kind aunt, and when she had seen an advertisement for a schoolteacher needed in Texas, she had jumped at the chance for a fresh start. She sent money home to her parents and younger siblings whenever she could, and she spoke of them with a love that made Jake respect her even more. In turn, Jake found himself opening up to Caroline in ways he rarely did with anyone. He told her about losing his mother young, about raising his sister as best he could while working whatever jobs he could find. He talked about the loneliness of the cowboy life, the constant moving, the lack of real connections or roots. And he admitted, one afternoon as they sat on the schoolhouse steps watching storm clouds gather in the distance, that he was tired of drifting. "I have been thinking," he said, staring out at the horizon, "that maybe it is time to settle down somewhere. Find a real job, maybe save up enough to buy a piece of land, build something that lasts." Caroline was quiet for a long moment, and when Jake finally worked up the courage to look at her, he found her watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "What changed?" she asked softly. "What made you start thinking about settling down?" Jake's heart pounded, and he knew this was a moment of truth. He could deflect, make a joke, keep things light and non-committal, or he could be honest, lay his cards on the table and risk everything. He chose honesty. "I heard a woman singing lullabies to borrowed babies," he said, holding her gaze, "and I realized I wanted to help give her babies of her own to sing to." Caroline's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. Color flooded her cheeks, and for a terrible moment, Jake thought he had gone too far, moved too fast, ruined everything with his blunt confession. Then she smiled, slow and wondering, and reached out to place her hand over his where it rested on the step between them. "That is quite possibly the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she whispered. Relief and joy surged through Jake in equal measure. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers, marveling at how perfectly her smaller hand fit within his own. "I know I do not have much to offer right now. I am just a cowboy with a little bit of saved money and no real prospects. But I am hardworking and I am honest, and I promise you, Caroline, if you give me a chance, I will spend every day trying to build a life worthy of you." Tears glistened in Caroline's eyes, but she was smiling through them. "Jake Thornton, I do not need you to be wealthy or have grand prospects. I just need you to be the man I have come to know these past 2 weeks. The man who is kind to children, who helps without being asked, who talks to me like I have thoughts worth hearing." She squeezed his hand. "That man is more than enough." Jake wanted to kiss her more than he had ever wanted anything in his life, but they were sitting in full view of the town, and Caroline had a reputation to protect. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a promise and a pledge. "I am courting you," he said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Properly, so everyone knows my intentions are honorable." "I would expect nothing less," Caroline said, laughter and happiness threading through her voice. Though I should warn you, there are going to be some very disappointed men in this town when word gets out." "Let them be disappointed," Jake said with a grin. "You are mine now, Caroline Webb, or at least I am hoping you will be." "I am hoping the same thing," she replied, and the look in her eyes made Jake feel like he could take on the world and win. True to his word, Jake began courting Caroline in earnest, and he did it in full view of Redemption Springs. He picked wildflowers and left them on the schoolhouse steps. He attended the church social with Caroline on his arm, enduring the knowing looks and whispered comments with good humor. He sat in the back of the schoolhouse one afternoon and watched her teach, marveling at her patience and skill with the students. And whenever he could, whenever Caroline had the chance, he accompanied her on her visits to the families with new babies. It was on one of these visits, about a month after their relationship had begun, that Jake truly understood the depth of Caroline's longing for children of her own. They were at the Robertson homestead, a small farm on the outskirts of town where Susan Robertson had given birth to a baby boy just a week earlier. Susan was exhausted, trying to manage the baby while also caring for her two older children and keeping up with the household chores. Caroline had arrived with a basket of food and an offer to help, and she had immediately taken charge in the gentle, unobtrusive way she had. Jake watched as Caroline bathed the baby with practiced hands, cooing to the infant as she gently washed his tiny limbs. She dressed him in a clean gown, talking to him the entire time in that soft, melodious voice that Jake had come to love. "There you are, sweet boy," she murmured, lifting the baby against her shoulder. "All clean and cozy. Shall we have a little cuddle while your mama rests?" She settled into a rocking chair, the baby nestled against her chest, and began to sing. It was the same lullaby Jake had first heard all those weeks ago, and watching Caroline now, seeing the pure love and contentment on her face as she held that baby, Jake felt his resolve solidify into something unbreakable. He was going to marry this woman. He was going to build her a home, fill it with children, and spend the rest of his life making sure she never regretted choosing a drifting cowboy over all the safer, more sensible options she could have had. After they left the Robertson homestead, walking back toward town in the golden light of late afternoon, Jake took Caroline's hand and voiced the question that had been burning in his mind. "Do you ever wish they were yours?" he asked quietly. "The babies you care for and sing to. Do you ever wish you were holding your own child instead of someone else's?" Caroline did not answer right away, and when Jake glanced at her, he saw a complicated mix of emotions playing across her face. Longing, sadness, hope, and something that looked like fear. "Every single time," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I hold a baby, sing them to sleep, smell that sweet baby scent, I ache with wanting one of my own. It is like a physical pain sometimes, this longing for a child to love and raise." She stopped walking, turning to face Jake fully. "I know it probably seems foolish, being so consumed with the idea of having children when I am not even married, but I cannot help how I feel. I look at those babies and I see the life I want so desperately, the family I have dreamed of having." Jake cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "It is not foolish at all, darling, and I want you to know something. I am going to give you that life, those babies, that family. I swear it on everything I hold sacred." "Jake," Caroline breathed, and this time when he leaned down to kiss her, she met him halfway. It was their first kiss, and it was everything Jake had imagined and more. Caroline's lips were soft and warm, and she tasted faintly of the peppermint tea she had been drinking at the Robertson homestead. The kiss was gentle, respectful, but charged with the promise of deeper passion to come. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Caroline's eyes were dark with desire. "We should probably get you back to town before people start gossiping," Jake said reluctantly, though he made no move to step away from her. "Probably," Caroline agreed, but she was smiling, "though I suspect they are already gossiping quite thoroughly." They walked the rest of the way hand in hand, and when they reached Caroline's small house near the schoolhouse, Jake kissed her once more on the doorstep before forcing himself to leave. He had plans to make, a future to build, and not much time to do it if he wanted to give Caroline everything she deserved. The next morning, Jake sought out Frank Morrison, the owner of the largest ranch in the area and the man who had hired Jake for several cattle drives over the years. Frank was a fair man, respected throughout the region, and Jake hoped he might be willing to help with the plan forming in Jake's mind. He found Frank at the ranch, overseeing the branding of some new calves. The older man looked up as Jake approached, wiping sweat from his brow and nodding a greeting. "Jake Thornton. I heard you were back in town and making quite a stir with our schoolteacher." Jake grinned, not bothering to deny it. "Word travels fast. It always does. What brings you out here?" "If you are looking for work, I do not have another drive scheduled until fall." "Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about something else," Jake said. "I am looking to settle down, Frank, buy some land, build a house, maybe start a small ranch of my own. I have some money saved, but not enough to buy much outright. I was wondering if you might know of anyone willing to sell a parcel at a reasonable price, or maybe someone who would be willing to work out terms." Frank's eyebrows rose. "You are really serious about this settling down business?" "As serious as I have ever been about anything." The rancher studied Jake for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the ranch house. "Come on, let us get out of this sun and talk properly." Over glasses of cool water in Frank's study, the two men discussed options. Frank told Jake about a piece of land about 3 miles outside of town, 50 acres of good grazing land with a creek running through it, and a stand of trees that would provide lumber for building. The land belonged to a widow whose husband had died the previous year, and she was looking to sell and move back east to be with her daughter. "She wants $600 for it," Frank said. "Which is fair, maybe even a little low considering the water access. Do you have that much saved?" Jake did some quick mental calculations. "I have about 400. I could probably make up the difference with work, but it would take time." Frank leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the armrest. "I will tell you what. You are one of the best hands I have ever had on a drive, Jake. Hardworking, honest, good with the cattle and the horses. I would hate to lose you permanently, but I respect a man who wants to build something for himself." He paused, seeming to come to a decision. "I will loan you the 200 you need, interest-free, on the condition that you work for me when I need extra hands, at least until the loan is paid off. And I will throw in 10 head of cattle to start your herd, payment for all the good work you have done for me over the years." Jake stared at the rancher, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Frank, that is incredibly generous. Are you sure?" "I am sure. Like I said, you are a good man, Jake Thornton. And if the rumors are true and you are planning to marry Caroline Webb, well, that girl deserves a man who is willing to work hard to provide for her. I have seen the way she is with the children in this town, how much she gives of herself. It would be nice to see someone give back to her for a change." Gratitude welled up in Jake's chest, so strong it was almost painful. "I do not know how to thank you." "Thank me by treating that land right, building a good life, and being happy," Frank said, extending his hand. "Do we have a deal?" "We have a deal," Jake said, shaking the rancher's hand firmly. The next 2 months were a blur of activity. Jake finalized the purchase of the land, spent every daylight hour clearing space for a house and outbuildings, and slowly began constructing a home with his own 2 hands. Frank sent over some of his ranch hands to help with the heavy work, and several men from town volunteered their time as well, partly out of goodwill and partly out of curiosity about the cowboy who had captured the heart of their beloved schoolteacher. Caroline visited the property every Sunday after church, bringing picnic lunches that she and Jake would share while he showed her the progress on the house. Jake watched her face light up as the structure took shape, as walls rose and a roof went on and windows were installed. He saw her imagining their future there, and it made him work even harder. By early August, the house was finished. It was not grand by any means, just a simple 4-room structure with a kitchen, a sitting room, and 2 bedrooms. But it was solid and well-built, with a wide front porch and glass windows that let in plenty of light. Jake had even managed to build some basic furniture, including a bed frame, a table with chairs, and a rocking chair that he placed near the fireplace in the sitting room. The rocking chair was the piece he was most proud of. He had crafted it carefully, sanding the wood until it was smooth and perfectly balanced for gentle rocking. He could picture Caroline sitting in that chair, a baby in her arms, singing those lullabies that had first captured his heart. On a Sunday in mid-August, Jake brought Caroline to the finished house. She had not seen it in 2 weeks, having been busy with preparations for the new school year, and he wanted to surprise her with the completed home. Caroline's reaction was everything he could have hoped for. She walked through each room slowly, running her hands over the walls, the furniture, the windowsills. When she reached the sitting room and saw the rocking chair, she turned to Jake with tears streaming down her face. "It is perfect," she whispered. "Jake, it is absolutely perfect." He crossed the room to her, pulling her into his arms. "It is yours, Caroline, this house, this land, this life I am building. I want it all to be yours." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "Marry me, please." "I know we have not been courting long by traditional standards, but I have never been more certain of anything. I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, filling this house with children and laughter and love." Caroline was crying in earnest now, but she was also smiling, radiant with joy. "Yes, yes, Jake, I will marry you. I love you so much." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, pouring all of his love and commitment into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and overwhelmed, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to make you so happy," he promised. "You already do," Caroline replied, and the truth of it shone in her eyes. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Redemption Springs, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Caroline wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, with wildflowers woven into her hair, and Jake thought she was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. Doc Patterson stood up as Jake's best man, and Sarah Miller, whose twins Caroline had helped care for, stood as Caroline's matron of honor. The ceremony was short but meaningful, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed his bride to enthusiastic applause from the congregation. The reception was held in the churchyard, with tables laden with food that the townspeople had contributed, and a fiddle player providing lively music. As the sun began to set, Jake and Caroline slipped away from the celebration, riding out to their new home in the wagon Jake had borrowed for the occasion. Caroline sat close to him on the bench seat, her head resting on his shoulder, and Jake felt a contentment so profound, it brought a lump to his throat. When they reached the house, Jake insisted on carrying Caroline over the threshold, tradition even on the frontier. She laughed, her arms around his neck, as he maneuvered them through the door and finally set her on her feet in the sitting room. The house was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight streaming through the windows, and for a moment they simply stood there holding each other, the weight of the moment settling over them. "This is our home," Caroline said softly, wonder in her voice. "Our home, Jake, I can hardly believe it." "Believe it, darling," Jake murmured against her hair. "This is just the beginning." He lit a lamp, and the warm glow filled the room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jake led Caroline to the bedroom, his heart pounding with a mixture of desire and nervousness. They were both inexperienced in the ways of physical intimacy, but they loved each other, and Jake was determined to make their wedding night special. They came together with tenderness and passion, exploring each other with gentle hands and whispered words of love. There was some awkwardness, some fumbling, but also laughter and joy and a connection that went beyond the physical. When they finally joined as husband and wife, Caroline cried out softly, clinging to Jake as he moved within her, and he felt a sense of completion that he had never experienced before. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Caroline's head on Jake's chest, his fingers trailing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Jake replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "More than words can say." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for. Life settled into a rhythm over the following months. Jake worked his land, building up his small herd with the cattle Frank had given him and a few more he was able to purchase. He also kept his promise to help Frank with ranch work when needed, earning money that he carefully saved and used to improve their property. Caroline continued teaching at the schoolhouse, riding into town each morning and returning each evening to the home she shared with Jake. She threw herself into making the house comfortable, sewing curtains for the windows, planting a vegetable garden, and filling the rooms with small touches that made it feel like a real home. But as much as they loved their life together, there was an unspoken awareness between them, a waiting for something that had not yet happened. Each month when Caroline's courses came, Jake saw the disappointment in her eyes, the way her hand would drift to her still flat stomach with a longing that broke his heart. They had been married for 4 months when Caroline came to him one evening as he was washing up after a day of working with the cattle. She moved up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and pressing her face against his back. "Are you all right, darling?" Jake asked, concerned by the unusual clinginess. "I am fine," Caroline said, but her voice was tight. Sarah Miller told me today that she is expecting again. The twins are barely 8 months old and she is already pregnant with another baby." Jake turned in her arms, gathering her close. He could feel her trembling, could sense the tears she was fighting to hold back. "Hey now, it will happen for us, Caroline, we just need to be patient." "But what if it does not?" The words burst out of her, raw and anguished. "What if I cannot have children, Jake? What if my body just cannot do it?" "Then we will deal with it together," Jake said firmly, tipping her face up so she had to meet his eyes. "I married you because I love you, Caroline Webb Thornton. Yes, I want children with you. I have been honest about that from the start. But if it turns out we cannot have children of our own, that does not change how I feel about you. We will find another way. Maybe we could take in an orphan, give a child who needs a home, a loving family. There are always options." Caroline searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or resentment, but she found only sincerity and love. Some of the tension drained out of her, and she nodded against his chest. "I am sorry. I know I am being emotional. It is just hard, seeing everyone around me having babies so easily, while we keep hoping month after month with nothing to show for it." "I know, darling, but it has only been 4 months. Some couples take years to conceive. We need to give it more time." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "And in the meantime, we can certainly keep trying. That is not exactly a hardship." That earned him a watery laugh, and Caroline swatted his chest playfully. "You are incorrigible." "You married me anyway," Jake pointed out, and he swept her up into his arms, carrying her toward the bedroom amid her delighted shrieks. They made love that night with renewed passion and purpose, and Jake prayed to a God he was not sure was listening that he would bless them with a child soon, before the longing in Caroline's eyes turned to genuine despair. Winter came to Texas that year with unusual cold, bringing freezing rain and winds that cut through clothing like knives. Jake spent long hours making sure the cattle had shelter and access to unfrozen water, while Caroline kept the house warm and had hot meals waiting when he stumbled in from the cold. It was a hard season, but they weathered it together, and Jake found that the challenges only brought them closer. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, Caroline reading aloud from books, while Jake worked on mending tack or carving small wooden toys that he planned to give to the children at the schoolhouse. Christmas arrived, and they celebrated quietly with just the two of them, exchanging simple gifts and attending the church service in town. Jake gave Caroline a new shawl he had purchased from the dress shop, and she gave him a shirt she had sewn herself, with intricate embroidery on the collar that must have taken her hours to complete. They spent the rest of the day in bed, making love and dozing and talking about their hopes for the coming year. It was one of the happiest days of Jake's life, perfect in its simplicity and intimacy. January turned to February, and then March arrived with the promise of spring. The days grew warmer, wildflowers began blooming across the prairie, and new calves were born to Jake's small herd. Life was renewing all around them, and Jake felt hopeful about the future. He was working on repairing a fence line one afternoon in early March, when he looked up to see Caroline riding toward him on the gentle mare they kept for her use. She was not due back from the schoolhouse for several more hours, and alarm shot through Jake as he saw the way she was riding, fast and somewhat recklessly for someone usually so careful. He dropped his tools and ran to meet her, catching the mare's bridle as Caroline reined her in. "What is wrong? Are you hurt? Did something happen in town?" Caroline slid down from the saddle, and Jake caught her, steadying her as she swayed slightly. Then she looked up at him, and Jake's breath caught at the expression on her face. It was joy, pure and incandescent, mixed with something that looked like disbelief. "I am pregnant," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "Jake, I am pregnant." For a moment, Jake could not process what she was saying. The words did not seem real, did not seem possible after months of hoping and waiting. Then they sank in, and a roar of triumph and joy surged through him. "You are sure?" he asked, his hands moving to her waist, then her still flat belly. "You are absolutely sure?" "Doc Patterson confirmed it this morning. I went to see him because I have been feeling strange for the past week, queasy in the mornings and tired all the time. He examined me and said I am definitely pregnant, probably about 8 weeks along." Tears streamed down Caroline's face, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. "We are going to have a baby, Jake. A baby." Jake let out a whoop of joy and picked Caroline up, spinning her around as she shrieked with laughter. He set her down carefully, suddenly terrified of hurting her or the precious life growing inside her, and cupped her face in his hands. "I love you," he said fiercely. "I love you so much, Caroline. Thank you for this gift." "I love you too," she whispered. And then they were kissing, pouring all of their happiness and excitement and love into the connection between them. When they finally pulled apart, Jake rested his hand on Caroline's stomach, marveling at the knowledge that his child was growing there, safe beneath his palm. "When?" he asked. "When will the baby come?" Doc says probably late September or early October. "He wants me to take things easy, especially in the last few months. No heavy lifting, plenty of rest, good food." Caroline bit her lip, a flicker of worry crossing her face. "I told him I would have to stop teaching eventually, probably by the end of May or early June at the latest. I cannot be standing in front of a classroom full of children when I am heavily pregnant. It would not be proper." "We will manage," Jake assured her, though his mind was already racing with concerns about money. Caroline's teaching salary had been supplementing what Jake made from the ranch, and losing that income would make things tight. But they would figure it out. They had to. Over the following weeks, Jake watched the changes in Caroline's body with fascination and awe. Her breasts grew fuller, her belly began to curve outward just slightly, and she had a glow about her that made her even more beautiful than usual. She also had terrible morning sickness that left her pale and shaky for the first few hours of each day, and Jake felt helpless as he held her hair back while she was ill, wishing he could take the discomfort on himself. But despite the physical challenges, Caroline was radiantly happy. She sang constantly, even more than usual, her hands frequently drifting to her growing belly as if she could not quite believe the miracle happening inside her. She began sewing tiny clothes, creating a layette with careful stitches and obvious love, and Jake would find her sometimes just sitting in the rocking chair he had made, holding the small gowns and blankets against her chest with tears of joy in her eyes. In late May, as promised, Caroline stopped teaching. The school board had hired a temporary replacement to finish out the year and would find a permanent teacher for the fall. Caroline pretended to be fine with it, but Jake could see the sadness in her eyes as she said goodbye to her students. Teaching had been such a large part of her identity, and giving it up, even temporarily, was harder than she had expected. "You will go back eventually," Jake assured her. "Once the baby is older, if you want to teach again, we will figure out a way to make it work." "Maybe," Caroline said, but she did not sound convinced. "Or maybe I will be too busy with children to think about teaching. If we are blessed with more babies, I might end up with my hands full just caring for our own." "That would not be such a terrible thing," Jake said, kissing her temple. "But the choice will be yours, darling. Whatever you want, we will make it happen." As Caroline's pregnancy progressed, she threw herself into preparing for the baby with single-minded focus. She organized and reorganized the small nursery they had set up in the second bedroom, washed the tiny clothes multiple times just to see them hanging on the line, and read every book on infant care she could get her hands on from the lending library in town. Jake, meanwhile, worked harder than ever to ensure they would have enough money to support their growing family. He took on extra jobs in town, helped with the spring branding at Frank's ranch, and even did some work breaking horses for settlers who needed riding animals but could not afford trained stock. The work was exhausting, but every time Jake felt like giving up, he would come home to find Caroline singing to her belly, talking to the baby about all the wonderful things they would do together, and it gave him the strength to keep going. Summer heat settled over Texas, oppressive and unrelenting, and Caroline grew increasingly uncomfortable. Her belly had swelled dramatically by August, and she moved with the careful waddle of a woman in her final weeks of pregnancy. Jake worried about her constantly, making sure she drank plenty of water and stayed out of the worst of the heat. On a scorching afternoon in late August, Jake came in from checking the cattle to find Caroline standing in the kitchen, one hand braced against the table, the other pressed to her lower back. Her face was pale and there was a tightness around her eyes that immediately set off alarms in Jake's mind. "Caroline, darling, what is wrong? I think. I have been having pains all day," she admitted. "Nothing terrible, just cramping that comes and goes, but it is getting stronger." Jake's heart began to pound. "Do you think it is the baby? Is it coming?" "I do not know. It is too early. Doc said late September at the earliest." Caroline gasped as another pain hit and Jake saw her knuckles go white as she gripped the table. "Oh God, Jake, something is wrong. It is too early." "I am getting Doc Patterson," Jake said, already moving toward the door. "You sit down, try to stay calm. I will be back as fast as I can." He saddled his horse in record time and rode into town like the devil was chasing him, not caring about the looks he got from people as he thundered down Main Street and pulled up in front of Doc Patterson's office. The physician was with a patient, but one look at Jake's face had him making apologies and grabbing his medical bag. They rode back to the ranch together, and Jake's stomach was in knots the entire way. What if something was wrong with the baby? What if Caroline was in danger? He had heard stories of women dying in childbirth, of babies born too early who did not survive. The thought of losing either Caroline or their child was unbearable. Doc Patterson examined Caroline in the bedroom while Jake paced the sitting room, wearing a path in the floorboards. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the doctor emerged, his expression serious but not alarmed. "Well," Jake demanded, "is she all right? Is the baby all right?" "She is in labor," Doc said bluntly. "Early, yes, but not dangerously so. I would estimate she is about 36 weeks along, which means the baby has a very good chance of being healthy and strong. Some babies just come early, Jake. It happens. But she is in pain. I saw her face. It looked bad." "Labor is painful," Doc said with the patience of someone who had explained this many times before. "That is just the reality of bringing a child into the world, but Caroline is young and healthy and I do not foresee any complications. It is going to be a long night, though. These things take time, especially with a first baby." Doc was right. It was a long night, stretching into the next day and then into a second night. Jake stayed by Caroline's side through all of it, holding her hand through the contractions, wiping sweat from her face, offering her sips of water when she could manage them. She labored with determination and courage, though Jake could see the exhaustion taking its toll as the hours wore on. Doc Patterson remained calm and encouraging throughout, checking Caroline's progress periodically and assuring them both that everything was progressing normally, if slowly. Jake tried to take comfort in that, but watching the woman he loved suffer was the hardest thing he had ever endured. Finally, as dawn broke on the second day of labor, Doc announced that it was time to push. Caroline was drenched in sweat, her hair plastered to her face, and Jake could see that she was running on pure determination at this point. But when Doc told her to push, she bore down with everything she had, her hand crushing Jake's as she worked to bring their child into the world. "That is it, Caroline," Doc encouraged. "The head is crowning. One more big push and we should have this baby." Caroline pushed again, a guttural cry tearing from her throat, and suddenly there was a new sound in the room. A thin, reedy wail that was the most beautiful thing Jake had ever heard. "It is a boy," Doc announced, lifting a squirming, red-faced infant and quickly checking him over. "A strong, healthy boy. Congratulations, you two." Jake stared at his son in shock and awe, unable to quite process that this tiny, perfect person was his. Caroline was crying, reaching out with trembling hands, and Doc carefully placed the baby on her chest, showing her how to support his head. "Hello, sweet boy," Caroline whispered, her voice thick with tears and exhaustion and overwhelming love. "Hello, my beautiful baby boy." The infant quieted at the sound of his mother's voice, turning his face toward her, and Jake felt something fundamental shift inside him. This was his family. His wife and his son. Everything he had ever wanted, everything he had worked for, was right here in this room. He leaned down, kissing Caroline's sweaty forehead and then gently touching one finger to his son's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around his, gripping with surprising strength, and Jake felt tears spill down his own cheeks. "He is perfect," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "Caroline, he is absolutely perfect. You did so well, darling. I am so proud of you." "We made him," Caroline said wonderingly, gazing down at the baby. "We made this perfect little person, Jake." Doc Patterson allowed them a few minutes to bond before he gently reclaimed the baby to finish cleaning him up and swaddling him properly. He then checked Caroline, making sure she was not bleeding excessively and that the afterbirth had been delivered completely. "Everything looks good," he pronounced. "You both did beautifully. Caroline, you need to rest now. Plenty of fluids, good food, and sleep when the baby sleeps. Jake, you are going to need to help out a lot these first few weeks. New mothers need time to recover." "I will do whatever she needs," Jake promised, and he meant it absolutely. Doc Patterson left them with instructions and supplies, refusing payment beyond what little cash Jake pressed into his hand. "Consider it my gift to the baby," the physician said with a smile. "I have known Caroline since she came to this town, and I cannot think of a young woman more deserving of happiness. Take care of them, Jake." "With my life," Jake replied. Alone with his new family, Jake carefully climbed into bed beside Caroline, who was nursing the baby for the first time with Doc's instructions still fresh in her mind. The baby latched on after a few attempts, and Caroline gasped at the sensation, but then relaxed into it. "It feels so strange," she said softly, "but also right somehow, like this is what my body was meant to do." "You are amazing," Jake told her, unable to take his eyes off his wife and son. "I have never seen anything more beautiful than you right now." They decided to name the baby Thomas, after Jake's father who had died when Jake was young. Thomas Jake Thornton. It was a good, strong name, and Caroline agreed it suited their son perfectly. The first weeks with Thomas were a blur of exhaustion and wonder. The baby needed to eat every few hours, day and night, and Caroline was healing from the birth, leaving Jake to handle most of the household chores and care for Caroline and Thomas. He did it gladly, though he had never been so tired in his life. But every time he held his son, felt the warm weight of him in his arms, smelled that sweet baby scent that Caroline had talked about, Jake felt renewed. This was what mattered. This was what life was about. Caroline proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving even when exhausted. Jake would find her in the rocking chair at all hours, nursing Thomas or simply holding him and singing the lullabies that had first drawn Jake to her. Watching her with their son, seeing the completion and joy in her face, Jake felt a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. She had wanted this so badly, this chance to hold and love a baby of her own rather than borrowed ones. And now she had it, and Jake had been the one to give it to her. Thomas grew quickly, as healthy babies do, filling out and becoming more alert and interactive. By the time he was 2 months old, he was smiling regularly, especially at his mother, and Caroline was completely besotted. Jake was not far behind, finding himself doing ridiculous things to make his son smile or laugh, willing to look like a fool if it brought joy to his child. As winter approached again, they settled into a rhythm as a family. Caroline still helped out occasionally with other families' children when they needed an extra hand. But now she brought Thomas along, and the mothers would sit together watching their babies while they talked and shared the experiences of motherhood. Caroline had never looked happier, more content, more at peace with her place in the world. Jake continued working the ranch, and with careful management and some good luck, they were doing better financially than they had the year before. The small herd was growing, and Jake had even been able to hire a young man from town to help with some of the heavier work, giving him more time to spend with Caroline and Thomas. On Christmas Day of 1883, Jake gave Caroline a gift he had been working on for months in secret. It was a cradle, beautifully carved from oak with rockers that moved smoothly and silently. He had carved details into the headboard, flowers and vines that he thought Caroline would like, and he had sanded it until it was smooth as silk. Caroline cried when she saw it, running her hands over the polished wood. "It is too beautiful to use. I want to keep it forever." "It is meant to be used," Jake said, lifting Thomas from where he had been sleeping in the makeshift cradle they had been using. He placed his son in the new cradle, and Thomas barely stirred, continuing to sleep peacefully. "And when he outgrows it, we will have other babies to put in it." Caroline looked up at him, hope and joy shining in her eyes. "Other babies, you want more." "As many as you are willing to give me," Jake said honestly. "I love being a father, Caroline. I love our family, and I would be honored to expand it if that is what you want too." "It is exactly what I want," Caroline whispered, and she kissed him deeply, both of them mindful of the sleeping baby nearby but unable to resist the pull between them. They made love that night after Thomas was fed and settled, coming together with the familiar passion that had never waned despite the exhaustion of new parenthood. And a few months later, Caroline discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy seemed easier despite her having a toddler to care for. Thomas was walking by the time Caroline's belly swelled noticeably, and he seemed fascinated by his mother's changing shape, often placing his small hands on her stomach and giggling when the baby kicked. "Baby," Caroline would tell him, reinforcing the concept. "You are going to be a big brother, Thomas. You will have a little brother or sister to play with." Thomas did not fully understand, but he would repeat "baby" in his sweet, high-pitched voice, and it never failed to make both Jake and Caroline smile. Caroline's second labor was faster than her first, only 12 hours from start to finish. And in October of 1884, they welcomed a daughter into the world. She was smaller than Thomas had been, with a cap of dark hair and lungs that announced her displeasure at being born with impressive volume. "A girl," Caroline breathed, cradling her daughter against her chest. "Oh, Jake, we have a little girl." They named her Emma Grace, and she was the image of her mother with the same blue eyes and the promise of the same blonde hair once the dark birth hair fell out. Thomas was initially wary of his new sister, but he quickly warmed to her, especially when Caroline showed him how to be gentle, how to touch the baby's hand or foot with his own small fingers. Life with two small children was chaotic and exhausting, but Jake had never been happier. He would come in from working the ranch to find Caroline sitting in the rocking chair with Emma nursing while Thomas played at her feet, and the scene filled him with such contentment he could hardly stand it. The ranch continued to grow as well. Jake's hard work was paying off, and by the time Emma was a year old, they had a respectable herd and were turning a decent profit. Jake was able to hire more permanent help, which freed up more of his time to spend with his family. Caroline eventually went back to teaching part-time when Emma was 2, taking over the younger children's classes a few mornings a week. She brought Thomas and Emma with her, and they would play in the corner of the schoolhouse while she taught. The arrangement worked well for everyone, and Caroline thrived on the intellectual stimulation of teaching again, even if it was only part-time. When Emma was 3 and Thomas was 5, Caroline became pregnant a third time. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, leaving her more exhausted and uncomfortable, and Jake worried constantly. But Caroline insisted she was fine, and Doc Patterson confirmed that both she and the baby were healthy. In July of 1888, on a sweltering hot day that had everyone in Redemption Springs seeking shade and cool water, Caroline went into labor. Jake had sent Thomas and Emma to stay with Sarah Miller, not wanting them to witness their mother's pain, and he stayed by Caroline's side through every contraction. This labor was the longest yet, stretching through the day and into the night. Caroline was exhausted, and Jake could see the strain on her face. But she pushed through, drawing on reserves of strength Jake did not know she possessed, and in the early hours of the morning, their second son was born. He was the biggest of their babies, lusty and loud from the moment he entered the world. Caroline laughed through her tears as Doc placed the baby on her chest, and Jake wrapped his arms around both of them, overwhelmed with gratitude and relief that they had come through safely. They named him Daniel, and he proved to be as strong-willed as his birth suggested. He was a demanding baby, needing constant attention and rarely satisfied for long. But he was also loving, giving generous smiles and belly laughs, and both Thomas and Emma doted on their new baby brother. With 3 children under the age of 6, Jake and Caroline's life was full to bursting. There were days when Jake wondered how they managed, how they kept all the pieces of their life together. But then he would look at Caroline, see her with all 3 of their children gathered around her, and he would remember that day years ago when he had heard her singing to borrowed babies. She was not singing to borrowed babies anymore. She was singing to her own, to the children she and Jake had created together out of love and commitment and the dream of building a family. She had everything she had longed for, and Jake had been able to give it to her. The years flowed by, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Jake and Caroline's love for each other only deepened. They had built a life together that was rich and full, grounded in the love they shared and the family they had created. Thomas grew into a responsible, thoughtful boy who loved helping his father with the ranch work. Emma was bright and curious, always reading and asking questions that sometimes stumped even her teacher mother. Daniel was the wild one, constantly getting into mischief but charming his way out of trouble with his infectious grin. When Daniel was 4, Caroline discovered she was pregnant again, much to everyone's surprise. They had assumed their family was complete, but life had other plans. This pregnancy was the easiest of all, and in the spring of 1892, Caroline gave birth to another daughter, tiny and perfect and immediately beloved. They named her Grace Caroline after Caroline and in honor of Emma's middle name. She was a peaceful baby, content to watch the world around her with wise eyes, and she completed their family in a way none of them had expected. With 4 children, the house Jake had built was bursting at the seams. He spent the next summer adding on 2 more bedrooms and expanding the kitchen, creating more space for their growing family. Caroline threw herself into making the additions feel like home, and by the time winter came, they had a house that truly reflected the life they had built together. The children grew and thrived, each developing their own personality and interests. Thomas eventually took over much of the ranch work from Jake, showing a natural talent for animal husbandry. Emma became a teacher like her mother, taking over the schoolhouse full-time when Caroline decided to retire from teaching to focus on raising Grace. Daniel surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for business, and he eventually opened a general store in Redemption Springs that became one of the most successful businesses in town. Grace, the baby of the family, became a gifted seamstress and eventually opened a dress shop that served the entire region. Through it all, through the years and the changes and the inevitable challenges that came with raising 4 children, Jake and Caroline remained devoted to each other. They still made time for quiet moments alone, still came together with the same passion and tenderness that had marked their early years. Jake never tired of watching Caroline with their children and eventually their grandchildren, never stopped marveling at the life they had created together. On a warm spring evening in 1910, Jake and Caroline sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold. They were both in their 50s now, their hair streaked with gray, their faces lined with the years. But when Jake looked at Caroline, he still saw the young woman he had first glimpsed through a window, singing lullabies to a borrowed baby. "Do you remember the day we met?" Caroline asked, as if reading his thoughts. "When you came to the schoolhouse and asked to share my lunch." "I remember," Jake said, taking her hand in his. "I was terrified you would turn me away. I was just a drifting cowboy with nothing to offer but some half-formed dreams." "You offered me everything I ever wanted," Caroline said softly. "You heard me singing to babies that were not mine, and you promised to give me babies of my own. And you kept that promise, Jake. You gave me Thomas and Emma and Daniel and Grace. You gave me this beautiful life, this home, this family. You gave me everything." Jake lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles the same way he had the day he declared his intention to court her. "You gave me just as much, darling. You gave me a reason to stop drifting, a place to call home, children to love and raise. You gave my life meaning and purpose. I was lost before I found you, Caroline. You saved me." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent, the land they had worked and loved stretching out before them. In the distance, they could see Thomas's house, built on the far corner of the property when he married. Emma lived in town with her husband and children. Daniel's house was visible to the south, and Grace still lived with them, though she was courting a young man from a neighboring ranch and would likely be married within the year. "We did well," Caroline said, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "We built something good here, Jake, something that will last beyond us." "We did," Jake agreed. "And it all started with a cowboy who heard you singing lullabies." Caroline laughed, the sound as musical now as it had been nearly 30 years ago. "I still sing lullabies, you know. Just now it is to grandchildren instead of our own babies." "I know," Jake said, smiling, "and I still stop whatever I am doing to listen whenever I hear you. Some things never change." They stayed on the porch until the stars came out, talking and reminiscing and simply enjoying each other's company. Inside the house, Grace was preparing dinner, and soon she would call them in to eat. But for now, Jake and Caroline were content to sit together. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, who had built a life of love and family and purpose. The cowboy had heard her singing lullabies to borrowed babies, and he had wanted to give her babies of their own. It was a simple dream, but it had grown into something far more beautiful and complex than either of them could have imagined. They had created a legacy of love, a family that would continue long after they were gone. And in doing so, they had found the happiness that every person searches for but few are lucky enough to truly find. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jake pulled Caroline closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder with a contented sigh. They had traveled far from that day when Jake first heard her singing, had weathered storms and challenges and the inevitable difficulties of building a life together. But through it all, their love had remained constant, an anchor that held them steady even when the winds blew fierce. "I love you, Caroline Thornton," Jake said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he spoke them. "I love you too, Jake Thornton," Caroline replied, "today, tomorrow, and always." And as the night settled over their ranch, over the land they had claimed and the family they had built, Jake and Caroline sat together in perfect contentment. Two souls who had found their home in each other and who would remain together for whatever years they had left, loving and being loved in return. Their story had begun with a song and a dream, with borrowed babies and the longing for children of their own. It had grown into something beautiful and enduring, a testament to what was possible when two people committed to building a life together. The cowboy and the schoolteacher, the drifter and the dreamer, had found in each other the missing piece that made them whole. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. They had loved well, built well, and created a family that would carry their legacy forward into generations yet to come. The lullabies Caroline had sung to borrowed babies had become lullabies sung to her own children, and eventually to her grandchildren. And the sweet melody of those songs would echo through the years, a reminder of where it all began and the love that made it possible. As they finally rose from the porch and went inside to join Grace for dinner, Jake took one last look at the land spread out before them, at the life they had built with their own hands and hearts. It was a good life, a life worth living, and he thanked God or fate or whatever force had led him to that window on that long-ago day when he first heard Caroline singing. Everything good in his life had flowed from that moment, from the decision to stop and listen, to pursue the woman with the beautiful voice and the tender heart. It had been the best decision Jake had ever made, and he had never regretted it for a single moment. Inside the house, warmth and light and the smell of good food welcomed them. Grace chattered about her day, about the dress she was working on for a client, and the plans she was making with her young man. Caroline listened with the same patient attention she had always given her children, and Jake watched them both with a full heart. This was home. This was family. This was love made manifest in the everyday moments of life shared with those who mattered most. And for Jake Thornton, former drifting cowboy who had found his purpose in a schoolteacher's song, it was more than enough. It was everything. The years continued to unfold gently for Jake and Caroline. Their children's children filled their lives with joy, and the ranch that had started with 50 acres and 10 head of cattle had grown into a substantial operation that provided well for multiple generations of Thorntons. Jake worked the land until his body simply could not do it anymore, and even then, he would sit on the porch and direct operations, offering advice and wisdom gained from decades of experience. Caroline spent her days tending her garden, reading and welcoming the constant stream of children and grandchildren who came to visit, drawn by her gentle spirit and the cookies she always had waiting. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1923, their children threw them a celebration that brought together what seemed like half of Redemption Springs. The town had grown considerably over the years, but the core community remained, and many of those present remembered when Jake and Caroline were newlyweds just starting out. During the celebration, Thomas stood and offered a toast to his parents. He was a man in his 40s now, successful and respected, but his voice shook with emotion as he spoke. "My father once told me that he fell in love with my mother when he heard her singing lullabies to borrowed babies. He said he knew, in that moment, that he wanted to give her babies of her own to love and cherish. What he could not have known then was that in building a family together, he and Mama would create something that would touch countless lives and leave a legacy that will endure for generations." Thomas raised his glass. "To Jake and Caroline Thornton, Thank you for showing us what true love looks like, for building a family grounded in faith and commitment, and for giving us all a home to return to. We love you both." The room erupted in cheers and applause, and Jake saw tears streaming down Caroline's face as she looked around at their children, grandchildren, and friends. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in the familiar gesture they had shared thousands of times over the years. "Worth it?" he asked softly, just for her ears. "Every single moment," she replied, squeezing his hand. "Every moment of joy and sorrow, every challenge overcome, every blessing received, all of it was worth it because I got to share it with you." They danced that night, swaying slowly to music provided by a small group of musicians from town. Jake held Caroline close, his cheek pressed against her hair, and thought about all the years they had spent together. All the moments, both ordinary and extraordinary, that had woven together to create the tapestry of their life. He thought about the first time he held Thomas, the overwhelming love and terror that had crashed over him. He thought about Emma's first steps, Daniel's first word, Grace's first smile. He remembered the hard years when money was tight and the future uncertain, and he remembered the good years when the crops were abundant and the cattle healthy. But most of all, he remembered Caroline. Caroline heavy with their children. Caroline singing lullabies in the rocking chair. Caroline teaching in the schoolhouse with patience and grace. Caroline working beside him to build their ranch. Caroline laughing, crying, loving, living. She was woven into every memory, every moment that mattered. She was the thread that held everything together, the beating heart of their family and their home. As the night wound down and their guests began to depart, Jake and Caroline stood at the door, thanking everyone for coming and accepting hugs and well wishes. When the last person had left and their children had finished cleaning up, Thomas, Emma, Daniel, and Grace gathered around their parents one final time. "We have something for you," Emma said, pulling out a package wrapped in brown paper. "We all went in on it together." Caroline unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a beautiful leather-bound book. She opened it to find page after page filled with photographs and written memories from their children and grandchildren. There were pictures Jake had never seen before, stories he had forgotten, testimonials from their children about what Jake and Caroline's love and example had meant to them. Caroline could not read past the first few pages before she broke down completely, sobbing into Jake's shoulder while he held her and struggled with his own emotions. Their children surrounded them, a circle of love and gratitude, and for several long minutes they all just held each other, a family bound by blood and love and shared history. Finally, Caroline pulled herself together enough to speak. "Thank you, all of you, for this beautiful gift, for being the people you are, for giving us grandchildren to spoil and love. You have made our lives rich beyond measure. You made us who we are," Thomas said simply. "Everything good in our lives can be traced back to the foundation you and Papa built. We are just trying to pass that on to our own children." That night, lying in bed with the memory book on the nightstand beside them, Jake and Caroline talked long into the darkness. They reminisced about their early days together, the struggles and triumphs, the moments of doubt and the moments of absolute certainty. They talked about their children, marveling at the people they had become, and their grandchildren who brought fresh joy into their aging lives. "Do you have any regrets?" Caroline asked as sleep began to pull at them both. Jake considered the question seriously before answering. "Not a single one. Oh, I made plenty of mistakes along the way, but I do not regret any of it because it all led us here to this moment with a family that loves us and a life well lived. What about you? Any regrets?" "Only that we will not have forever," Caroline said softly. "That someday one of us will have to go on without the other. That frightens me, Jake. I cannot imagine life without you." Jake pulled her closer, tucking her head under his chin. "When that time comes, and it will come for all of us eventually, the one left behind will have all these memories to hold on to. And we will have the family we created, the children and grandchildren who carry pieces of us forward. We will never truly be gone as long as they remember us, as long as the love we shared continues to echo through them. "Promise me something," Caroline whispered, "anything. Promise me that if I go first, you will not stop living. That you will still find joy in the children, in the land, in the sunrise and the sunset. I cannot bear the thought of you just giving up." "I promise," Jake said solemnly. "And you have to promise me the same. If I go first, you keep singing, Caroline. Keep sharing that beautiful voice with the world. Keep loving our children and grandchildren. Keep being the light you have always been." "I promise," she whispered, and they sealed it with a kiss that tasted of 40 years of love and commitment. They had many more good years after that anniversary. Jake lived to be 73, finally succumbing to a heart that had worked hard all his life and simply wore out. He died peacefully in his sleep one night in 1929, with Caroline beside him as she had been for nearly half a century. The grief nearly destroyed her. Jake had been her partner, her best friend, her great love for so long that she did not know how to exist without him. But she remembered her promise, and she leaned heavily on her children and grandchildren as she navigated the terrible waters of loss. Slowly, painfully, Caroline found her way back to life. She moved in with Grace, who had never married and was glad for her mother's company. She spent her days surrounded by family, telling stories about Jake to grandchildren who hung on her every word. And she sang, just as she had promised. She sang to great-grandchildren who were born after Jake's death, giving them the gift of lullabies that had started everything so long ago. Caroline lived to be 81, passing away peacefully in 1933 with all 4 of her children at her bedside. Her last words were, "I am coming, Jake," and there was a smile on her face as she drew her final breath. They buried her next to Jake on the ranch they had built together, under the sprawling oak tree that Jake had always loved. Their graves became a place where the family gathered for special occasions, a reminder of where they came from and the love that had started it all. Thomas took over the ranch completely, running it with the same dedication his father had shown. Emma continued teaching until she retired, influencing hundreds of students over her long career. Daniel's business empire grew to include several stores across Texas. Grace's dress shop became legendary, known throughout the region for the quality of her work. All of them married, had children, and those children had children of their own. The Thornton family tree grew and branched, spreading across Texas and beyond, but the roots remained firmly planted in the soil that Jake and Caroline had claimed and cultivated with their own hands. And through all the generations that followed, the story was passed down. The story of the cowboy who heard a woman singing lullabies to borrowed babies and decided he wanted to give her babies of her own. The story of 2 people who built a life together based on love and commitment and shared dreams. The story of Jake and Caroline Thornton, whose legacy was not wealth or fame, but the family they created and the love they shared. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. And somewhere, in whatever lies beyond this life, Jake and Caroline were together again, their love undiminished by death, eternal as the stars that had witnessed their journey from the beginning. The cowboy and his bride, united forever, their story complete and their legacy secure in the hearts and lives of those they left behind.